Good evening. I'm Tom Putnam, the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Heather Campion, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, Raytheon, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, Viacom, and WBUR. Many historians refer to the presidency of John F. Kennedy as unfinished, and that is especially true in relation to his civil rights agenda. As Peniel Joseph has written, the early 1960s are often considered the heroic period of the civil rights movement, marked by the freedom rides, the lunch counter sit-ins, the integration of the universities of Mississippi and Alabama, and President Kennedy's speech in June of 1963 that put the full weight of the federal government and the moral authority of the Oval Office behind the effort to end legalized segregation. We're confronted primarily with a moral issue, JFK told the nation that night. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. Over the past few years, the Kennedy Library has chronicled the various 50th anniversaries of these landmark events, including a day-long conference on the March on Washington and a forum last spring on how the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed and signed into law. Earlier this year, the nation marked the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, and it occurred to us we should organize a forum to look at the history of race relations that followed the Kennedy years. Peniel Joseph is a professor of history at Tufts University and the author of 2 award-winning histories of the Black Power movement, which he describes as, quote, the belief in self-determination and the understanding that political power, rather than morality, is the key to racial and economic justice. Most recently, he published a biography on Stokely Carmichael, which fellow panelist John Stauffer describes as, quote, exhaustively researched and beautifully written. This nuanced biography reveals the crucial interconnections between militants and moderates, nationalists and integrationists, with Stokely emerging as an essential leader of the civil rights movement. The book is on sale in our museum store, and Professor Joseph will sign your copies. I found it hard to put down, and who can resist a narrative history with an opening chapter temptingly titled The Chocolate Fred Astaire? In addition to writing reviews of other books, John Stauffer is a professor of others' books. John Stauffer is a professor of American literature and African American studies at Harvard. His 8 books include The Black Hearts of Men, Radical Abolitionists and the Transformation of Race, and Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, which both won numerous awards. Elaine Jones served as the first female director counsel and president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where her efforts led to a landmark Supreme Court case abolishing the death penalty in 37 states, and where she successfully argued numerous employment discrimination cases. She's participated in many of our 50th anniversary commemorations, and it's always wonderful to have her voice and her perspective on panels such as this one. Our moderator this evening is Kim McLarin, an accomplished writer and novelist who appears regularly on Basic Black, Boston's long-running television program on WGBH Public Television. It's not lost on anyone in this audience, I'm sure, that we gather this evening in the shadow of the events unfolding in Ferguson, Missouri. In reading Professor Joseph's books, I was reminded in his words how past struggles for racial justice shape our present, and of the promise the Black Power movement once offered to move all willing Americans to a more equitable and fulfilling social order. We examine the past, JFK once stated, to awaken our future. We certainly hope tonight's conversation can help inform an even larger national discussion on how, moving forward, we as a country and a people best bridge the growing racial divide in our times. Please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy Library Peniel Joseph, John Stauffer, Elaine Jones, and Kim McLarin.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. I'm from the South, so when we say good evening, we expect people to say it back. Good evening. Good evening. All right, thank you. Very nice, thank you. It's really an honor and very exciting to be here. We're going to jump right into the conversation and have a wonderful conversation with our panelists here for, I don't know, about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll bring the audience in. And it really is just a free-flowing conversation. There's so much to touch on. We could probably go 3 hours, but we will try not to do that. And I thought we would begin by really understanding, and you made such an excellent point about we are gathered here in the shadow of Ferguson, and I think the most compelling question now is how does the civil rights movement, or the Black freedom movement, as we might rechristen it, I think some people are rechristening it, we'll get to that, shape our understanding of what's happening in Ferguson today. But to do that, we have to understand the movement and the traditional, maybe the traditional narrative of it, and how that narrative in some ways should be complicated. So maybe we start with that and how the Black Power movement fits into that, and how the original Black freedom movement, beginning with the Black abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, fits into that. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I think we'll just jump right in, and maybe I'll start with Peniel, that maybe he could give us that kind of traditional arc of, you know, what the understanding of is where it began, right? The 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, though of course we know it began before that, but maybe giving us what is the traditional arc of the civil rights movement, and then what that leaves out and why we need to complicate that.
Yeah, very, very quickly, I think we all realize now there was a long, not even just long civil rights movement, but a long Black freedom struggle. I think John's work has been instrumental in sort of uncovering the many layers. His dual biography, Giants of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, is really a masterpiece in terms of diving into the 19th century, and not just abolitionism, but the way in which slavery is so crucial to these debates over democracy in the United States. So that, you know, to speak in, I'm from Southside Jamaica, Queens, from New York City, so I can speak like this. Just from jump, race has been central to the founding and the formation of American democracy and this republic, this nation state. And that, I think that's sometimes not treated as a given when we think about all our analyses of whether it's feminism or the environment or mass incarceration or poverty, anything, right? In terms of the civil rights movement, the modern movement, like you're saying, what's the regular narrative? And, you know, Elaine has been a big participant, observer, activist, practitioner in that modern movement. But the modern movement, 54 to 65, what I call the heroic period of the civil rights movement, certainly civil rights activism predates that, okay? So you can get to Marcus Garvey, you can talk about Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching crusade, you can talk about National Council of Negro Women. There's so many different Black women and men, along with white allies. There's a Latino connection here. There's great new scholarship on, there's an Afro-Latino reader that everybody should get that looks at Afro-Latinos and their connection to this Black freedom struggle in the 19th and 20th century. So there's a big river here. But when we think about 54 to 65, the reason that's so important is that 54 to 65 is where, in that 11 years, there is actually a political revolution that happens in the United States. And no less than John Kennedy talked about that June 11th, 1963, in a very, very famous, very important race speech. But the Brown decision, May 17th, 1954, what Brown does is overturn the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision that said separate but equal was constitutional. And what it's going to do is open up a Pandora's box. So from Brown all the way to the Voting Rights Act, you have everything from Emmett Till, you have everything from the Little Rock Central High School crisis, you've got the SNCC, the sit-ins, and Ella Baker. And what's interesting is that there's multiple generations that participate in this. So you've got Ella Baker, who's 57 years old when she helps found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Easter weekend 1960, and she is a long marcher. She's somebody who's an organizer, she's a radical Democrat, she's a radical feminist. You've got somebody like Lorraine Hansberry. And I'm pointing out women on purpose because women, Black women, are so crucial. Lorraine Hansberry is really the original founder of the Black arts movement, and she does that through A Raisin in the Sun in 1959. You've got Fannie Lou Hamer, who's the sharecropper turned activist and organizer of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So when we think about that heroic period, 60 to 65 is crucial because not only do you have SNCC, but you've got the Freedom Rides, you've got James Meredith in 1962. In 63, King is arrested in Birmingham, helping out a local movement, Fred Shuttlesworth. And Letter from a Birmingham Jail, so important because King cast the movement as part of this grand tradition of fighting for democracy. He says that the young people who are being arrested in Birmingham are bringing back the nation to what he calls those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the Founding Fathers. And in 64 and 65, with the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, they sort of end that sort of classic period. Now, this is an overly simplified narrative, and we're going to get to what's the underside of this. But in that narrative, one thing to remember is that it's happening on multiple levels. There's the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson administrations, but then there's this grassroots activists, people who are poor, sharecroppers, people who are poor in Harlem, Boston, Ruth Babson here, a public school integration movement. But then there's also a group of people who are civil rights professionals, people who are part of the NAACP, people who are part of the Urban League. So what's interesting is all these movements are working on different levels together. What we do as scholars usually, we focus on one strand of it and not all. So at its best, it's sort of a symphony, right? So instead of thinking it's just Lyndon Johnson, or it was just John Kennedy, or it was just Ella Baker, or it was just Fannie Lou Hamer, it's all of those people at the same time. And that's our story. And it's tough to get that story out, but that's the story.
Okay, well, we can all go home now because Peniel has pretty much answered every question I was going to answer, and I was going to ask. And Elaine, I was going to say, one of the questions I had was who does that traditional narrative leave out? One of which is women, right? The traditional, but Peniel's already answered that. But the traditional narrative, which focuses on the charismatic leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King, for example, traditionally leaves out the women very much of Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and these women. But who else? Elaine, who else maybe doesn't get the credit they deserve, or who else gets unprivileged in this narrative? And why is it important today for us to understand, right, who else maybe gets left out of that heroic?
Well, Peniel is right in that it is a symphony. And it starts from when black people first came to these shores. I mean, it's a centuries-long symphony. It extends, 400 years. And we have gotten to where we are today through fits and starts. And the point that I always make is African Americans have not arrived where we are now in this country by ourselves. We've not done it. I mean, and I think about the struggles, and this is a nation of laws. And so what had to be changed was law. And what Brown did for the first time was recognize the personhood of African Americans. That's what, as a matter of law, which had not been. Now I look at the Congress with the Civil Rights, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Civil Rights Act. There were no black people in the Senate. No black people in the Senate when those Civil Rights Acts were passed. And I look at Brown itself. Brown was a 25-year struggle that started in 1929 at Howard University, 25 years. But the women, Constance Baker Motley, who represented James Meredith, who was best buddies with Medgar. It was Constance Motley down there. It was NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Thurgood had his role at the organization I was privileged to later head. Thurgood had his role. And I understand at one point there was a conversation with Thurgood and Martin in which, which Thurgood was, Thurgood was telling Dr. King about putting all these folks in harm's way. Because Thurgood was a consummate lawyer. He believed in the processes and the courts. And Martin said, look, Mr. Marshall, you have your role, and I have mine. Mm-hmm. And he said, now your role is to come to get me out of jail and to help us.
Role.
And so it was critically important.
Yes.
I mean, it was a lawyer, a legal defense fund lawyer, who brought the letter from the Birmingham jail from Martin out. So
there had to be.
It had to be, and so all of this notion of symphony is right, and so many periods.
Right, and a symphony that extends back, as you were saying, even before, right? We can go back to, and maybe we can bring John in here to bring, the original, and I think that's a very important point that often gets lost. I actually teach a literature of slavery and freedom class, and we start with David Walker. And most people don't even know who David Walker was, and you can't really understand Stokely Carmichael unless you understand David Walker, right? Stokely Carmichael doesn't come out anywhere, and of course Frederick Douglass, the consummate black abolitionist. So maybe John, you could jump in here about how does Frederick Douglass help pave the way for?
Well, I can start with Stokely Carmichael. With David Walker. David Walker is widely renowned as David Walker is an African American who grew up in the West End of Beacon Hill, and he's best known for this pamphlet called The Appeal to the Citizens, the colored citizens of the world, especially the slaves. So it's not just the American, but all colored citizens, blacks. And it's a pamphlet that's really a blueprint or the foundation of black nationalism.
Right, in 1829.
In 1829, republished 1830, 1831. It disseminates into the southern states because he has a clothing store on the wharfs of Boston, and he ingeniously sews copies of the pamphlet in the lining of the coat, sends it down south, and it's discovered in plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana, and it coincides, the popularity of the pamphlet coincides with Nat Turner's rebellion. And so he's seen as partly responsible for Nat Turner, who's a huge hero for African Americans. And David Walker articulates something that a lot of whites still don't appreciate about black nationalism. What it constitutes, what it means is, one, black pride. That's crucial. As Peniel noted, self-determination and political action are central to it. And for black nationalists, whites need to appreciate and understand blacks on blacks' own terms. Whereas so many whites, even sympathetic whites to the idea and theory of racial equality, assume that blacks need to accept the white morality and start acting and behaving like whites. So black nationalism is not separatism. David Walker was a friend of Charles Sumner, who was the great abolitionist senator whose Civil Rights Bill literally becomes the blueprint for Johnson's Civil Rights Act. Yes, right. And it was Charles Sumner who brings in the phrase equality before the law. He first uses it in fighting for desegregation of public schools in Massachusetts, which is passed in 1855. And Frederick Douglass was a close friend who was a crucial advisor, in a sense, on the Civil Rights Bill. And Johnson has his aides use that literally as a blueprint for it. And Sumner and Douglass and David Walker, they all knew each other. In fact, Sumner grew up, and I've walked it. It's a 50-second walk from Sumner's home, which is a boarding house in the west end of Beacon Hill, to David Walker's house. I mean, that's how intimate that community was. I mean, you should take a tour with an African-American meeting house in Beacon Hill. It's the black leadership of America, the first civil rights movement. You have David Walker Walker and William Cooper Nell, William Wells Brown lived there, Lewis Hayden lived there, Charles Sumner lived there. These are all forerunners of Stokely.
Right there, yeah.
Right there.
It's extraordinary. Of course,
There's a straight line from these people to what
and
people
I
was
want to get
writing
into
on.
the point you made about black nationalism not being separatism, and this will bring us back forward, and maybe defining some of these terms as we start to move forward. Separatism, segregation, desegregation versus integration, right? You know, when talking about what were the goals of the heroic period of the civil rights movement, what do we understand our goals to be? What were the goals understood to be, and maybe why, what that means for us going today? You know, what is integration versus desegregation? But the point I wanted to make about David Walker as the appeal, because I want everybody to go out and research this and read it, is that the pamphlet is, he models the pamphlet on the U.S. Constitution, right? So there's a preamble and then 4 articles. It's a very interesting, but the 4th article talks about that you know, we're not, because the 4th article is about the colonization plan and how we're not going back to Africa. This is our country, basically, is what he says. So it's important to understand that foundation of black nationalism as not being an abandonment of America, but in fact an embracing of America. But let's get into this question of maybe the goals, the stated goals of the civil rights movement and the black, and then I want to get into the Black Power movement specifically, and then what about those goals maybe led us to, you know, what about the unstated goals? Like, what was the goal of the civil rights movement? Maybe that's too broad a question, but was it simply an end to legalized segregation? That's what people understand was the goal. Elaine, do you want to jump in? Or?
Black Americans simply were not citizens of this country. We were not citizens. We were here, had been here, working to build it all, but we not only were not citizens, we were property. We were owned. And there's something called Stroud's 12 Propositions of Slavery, which came out in the early 1800s. And it says, of Negro slavery only can this proposition be affirmed, that nothing that a black person owns belongs to them. Slaves in Egypt and everywhere else could have property themselves. But we had nothing. So it was a struggle simply to be included. And then it took a civil war, which almost tore this nation apart. That's why Lincoln is Lincoln. I mean, and so even getting written into the Constitution with the amendments, once again, we were represented in law, but not in fact. Didn't have any of the rights. We were supposed to have them. The 15th Amendment said we had the right, that black men had the right to vote in 1870. Didn't have it. Soon as black men exercised that right to vote between 1870 and 1900 and elected 24 blacks to Congress. As soon as that happened, all of the states started changing their constitutions and literacy tests and poll tax. In other words, you have the right, but we don't expect you to exercise it. And so, I mean, it's been, and that's the fits and the starts, and so it's been incremental. The way has been paved with all of our blood.
Right. Yes.
You know,
yes.
And the progress, yes, progress has been made, but we still aren't there. Because every once in a while it erupts again. And here we are because we still have underlying issues that have yet to be resolved.
Peniel?
I think I'm completely on board with what Elaine said. I think that in terms of specifically the heroic period, it depends on where one looks. So this whole idea of citizenship is yes. Right?
I guess what I'm asking is, what did people think was the goal, and why is that? You know, why might that lead to complications about whether that goal was finally finished today? I think if people think the goal was simply to remove, right, you know, de facto or de jure, I guess rather. Sorry, de jure. I'm not a lawyer. Sorry, Elaine.
De facto or de jure,
yeah. Yeah.
But I think
that's why they think it was successful.
we need to go back before 1954. So somebody like Medgar Evers, who's a World War II veteran, who's coming, when we think about double V, victory over fascism, abroad, victory over racism at home. So the politics of the United States of America, global politics, 1930s, 40s, radical social democratic politics, radical Marxist politics, radical liberalism, trade unionism, okay? So when we think about the 1930s, 40s, very important for black people, everything from Father Divine and the Nation of Islam, but also A. Philip Randolph, right? But also, if we want to talk about the single most important black woman in the 1930s, we're thinking about Mary McLeod Bethune, because what she does is really, we praise Mrs. Roosevelt, but it's not just Mrs. Roosevelt, it's Mary McLeod Bethune, who's, and again.
Tell people who she is so there you have an
And Mary
understanding.
McLeod Bethune is really one of the most important radical black educators of the 20th century, Bethune-Cookman College. She's somebody who makes sure that parts of the New Deal black people are going to have access to it, whether it's the Civilian Conservation Corps or different, the Works Progress Administration.
Right.
She sets up in 1937 a conference on Negro youth that Eleanor Roosevelt comes. And I give Eleanor Roosevelt credit. She listened, right? But the person who's pulling her coat to what's going on in the black community, it's Mary McLeod Bethune. So from that perspective, in terms of the heroic period of the Civil Rights Movement, what people wanted in the 30s and 40s was radical racial and economic justice that was unfettered by racial segregation. And you said, what was the difference between integration and desegregation? People were pushing for radical racial integration, not just desegregation, but racial integration in the 1930s and 40s. And where this connects to Ferguson and the stuff that we're going to talk about later is that Roosevelt, and the best book on this is Ira Katz Nelson's Fear Itself and When Affirmative Action Was White. But When Affirmative Action Was White is just a small portion of the research he did for the monumental Fear Itself, the Bancroft Prize winner. It's like 800 pages, which really looks at the Roosevelt administration and the way in which we get two-tiered liberalism from Roosevelt, one for black, one for white. Blacks don't have access to the GI Bill at the same rate, or the Federal Housing Authority. The big problem for blacks then is that this is in perpetuity. There's a 70-year crisis because of this. This is connected to Bob Moses and the Power Builder and the equity that we have in houses that white people had access to, working class whites, middle class whites, Levittowns. Black people had no access. And this includes Ferguson and St. Louis County. There's a great paper on this. And when Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about reparations, the case for reparations, this is all connected to this scholarship. So the problem when we think about, and I'm getting ahead of myself very briefly about Ferguson is this. Ferguson is not just the segregation in Ferguson and the poverty is not just the result of white flight and personal prejudice. It's not just the result of that. It's actually the result of decades-long public policy that are national. Certainly, they're in Missouri, but they're in all 50 states. And what that did was not just segregate the races, right? At times, it perpetuated more racial segregation in the 40s and 50s than had previously existed. Certain neighborhoods all across the United States that had relative racial equality got reformed because the FHA wouldn't build in places where black people were, okay? So the federal government practice segregation that is so embedded in our culture now, we think it's like breathing and drinking water.
And the results of individual actions when in fact it's not. And that's what's critical. So John, do you want to jump in here? That's a really important.
And policy.
And policies.
Policy, it was policy making.
Right. So yeah, again, Peniel has answered all the questions. So, but it's a very important point because it does bring us up to the present day, and we can start moving into that understanding because without that understanding, it is difficult to understand what's going on in Ferguson. It's difficult to understand why our urban schools are more segregated now than they were when I was a kid, right? But the majority of black students in this country attend more deeply segregated schools than they did 30 years ago. This, and the list goes on and on. And then the poverty that black children experience is more intense in some ways, right? The most impoverished. So it's important to understand all of that in this context.
And the studying of the housing policies is really enlightening. I mean, can't get the financing, the racially restrictive covenants. You can't sell to certain folk. Government policy and making sure even desegregated communities that we had through government policy and building and creating homes, making sure that it was segregated and closed to blacks. You just couldn't, you're right, GI Bill.
Right.
Levittown, we couldn't, black servicemen couldn't get that.
But also zoning, because there's a
Zoning.
reason why communities look the way they do.
Industrial zoning, yeah, in the black community.
You can build toxic waste dumps in black communities. There's a reason why black communities have liquor stores and churches right next to residences, right? There are certain black communities that were part of originally unincorporated land all across the United States. White suburbs incorporated and then actually annexed black communities and raised those communities to build parks. I mean, this is part of our history. I mean, it's something extraordinary. And if you interview the people who lost their homes in the Overtown section of Miami or parts of St. Louis County near Ferguson, it's heartbreaking. It's actually heartbreaking because people had homes that were completely razed.
Well, I don't know that you even need to go that far. I mean, there's parts of Boston that that used to be, right, you know, solid black working class communities that were raised to make progress. So this is true. And again, it's important to understand this in order to understand, and this is something I'd like to stress, especially for the young people here and for my students, that it is the structural racism or the racial inequality cannot be understood as such an individual, as actions by individuals. And so this is important. And the part you're making about the very way the white middle class was built in this society after the World War II, many of these things were systematically denied to African Americans.
And that's why Thurgood Marshall was ecstatic in 1948 when he got the Supreme Court to decide Shelley versus Kramer in a way to remove the restrictive covenants from deeds so that whites could then sell to blacks, because there was a restriction in the law. They could not even sell to blacks. And so blacks would get straw people to buy the properties, get friends who were whites to buy the properties, and then deed it to them. So it goes on. It
goes on. So let's bring it up to Ferguson then, and let's talk about the ways in which the young people who are activists, who are out right now today, waiting for this announcement, which we don't know when will come, how are they influenced by this period? Especially, we haven't really touched a lot on the Black Power movement, so maybe you want to jump in here, Peniel, or just talk about Stokely. What?
Can we talk about? I want
to
hear
about
Peniel.
You want to ask him a question about Stokely?
I do. I want to ask Peniel.
Okay, you did say that earlier, so go ahead.
Okay, I want to ask Peniel, why the biography of Stokely? Why Stokely?
That's a good question.
That's a great question. No, I think Stokely is very, very relevant to our times. I mean, I first found out about Stokely Carmichael from growing up in New York City, and I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1964. And my mother, who is 76 years old now, but was a hospital worker in New York City and part of 1199. SCIU. So I was on my first picket line at 8 years old in New York City. And so
that explains a lot. Go ahead.
Yeah, it does explain a lot for both good and I'm sure some flaws and shortcomings. No, Stokely I found out about through Eyes on the Prize, and which is the Henry Hampton and Callie Crossley and all these
great masterful
series about the civil rights movement. And Stokely was like me from the Caribbean, where his people were from the Caribbean. He was born in Port of Spain, Trinidad. In 1941, he moved to the Bronx right before his 11th birthday. He went to Bronx Science High School, one of the best public schools in the country, and was an organizer. He was mentored by Bayard Rustin, the great social democratic activist and March on Washington organizer. But he was also inculcated in a New York City left in terms of a white and Jewish left. But he was also nurtured by these Pan-Africanists as well. So Stokely became a student activist even before the sit-in movements of the 1960s. But then when the sit-in movement started, he was at Howard University, and Howard is a hotbed. Everything, when we think about what Elaine has done and I know you're UVA, but Howard is very, very important in Washington, D.C. because Howard University was the black it starts out as a land-grant institution, definitely, but it was the black Harvard. It was the institution that produced, we have Charles Hamilton Houston. We have all these different people who come out of Howard University, and he fits into that tradition. And Stokely is part of a group of radical students from Howard University.
He's not radical at first. Maybe what Elaine is getting at, and he is not initially radical. I mean, he's radical. I mean, but he's initially, and maybe what's important for people to know about Stokely is that he is initially very much in the nonviolent Martin Luther King protest, right, action. I mean, what we all know about Stokely is that he coins the phrase Black Power, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe you can talk about that and how he perhaps bridges he represents the frustrations of the young people who grew frustrated with perhaps the traditional civil rights movement.
Yeah, no,
Talk
certainly.
about why Black Power, and what did that mean, and what does that mean today, and why was that so threatening?
Well, he was militantly nonviolent, so I'd say yes, he's militantly nonviolent.
That's a great phrase, militantly nonviolent.
He's arrested in Mississippi for the first time at 19, and between 61 and 66, he's arrested 27 times. He definitely has a close friendship with Martin Luther King Jr., but after Freedom Summer, he becomes further radicalized, because Freedom Summer is a heartbreaking event for at least a strain of SNCC activists who wanted, by 1964, who wanted the MFDP, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, to be seated. And that's when Mrs. Hamer gives her famous "Is This America" speech at the Credentials Committee in August of 1964. And Lyndon Johnson schedules an impromptu press conference to take Mrs. Hamer off the screens, because she's a sharecropper from Ruleville, Mississippi, and she's saying on national television, she's saying, "Is this America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where we are beaten for wanting to live like decent human beings?" And so she's...
And it's not just national television, international.
That's
the important thing.
Yeah.
We also forget, right, that the world is watching at this moment. This is part of the reason people did move, right, that Johnson did move, is that international pressure. But go ahead.
So she becomes this really icon of speaking truth to power, but of grassroots local activism. And Stokely moves from Mississippi, where he's part of Freedom Summer. He's the 2nd Congressional District Director. And the best thing to know about Stokely is Stokely had a range, even after Black Power, of friends, white, black, everything in between. Hugely charismatic, hugely funny, hugely bold. They called him the Delta Devil, who's driving and escaping from racial terrorists at 120 miles per hour in the Deep South. And that's real in terms of people were in fear of their lives, and if they were caught, bad things were going to happen.
Yes.
But by 66, he's calling for Black Power in Greenwood, Mississippi. And for him, Black Power is radical self-determination. So in a way, when we think about Ferguson, one of the things that, when we talk about the Molotov cocktails that were being thrown, Stokely is connected to not just Black Power, but the Black Panthers as well. Both the original Panthers in Lowndes County. So he's speaking with a voice, and he becomes a revolutionary. You're right. He's not initially a revolutionary.
Times, and I think that's what the times may
transformed.
Exactly. And I think that's what is important. And maybe, John, you can jump in here, too, about how Frederick Douglass, go ahead.
Stokely's, in a sense, a perfect echo of Frederick Douglass, who begins championing, I think Peniel's term of militant nonviolence is absolutely appropriate. After he begins traveling throughout the North and the Midwest for American Anti-Slavery Society, he becomes radicalized when he's almost killed in Pendleton, Indiana, and he increasingly becomes a revolutionary. I mean, I refer to him as a prudent revolutionary, championing violence.
I love these
he
phrases.
Says throughout from the late 1840s through the Civil War, he says that a slave owner has no right to live. A slave who kills his master is following the heroes of the Revolution, should be championed as a revolutionary hero. So the trajectory, like Stokely, depends on the circumstance. And one of the great tributes of Peniel's book is he cast Stokely not just as one of the great African Americans, but one of the great American leaders. And one of the reasons why the book is so important is that there's been a long history in America of forgetting or remembering African Americans. So Frederick Douglass, for example. Douglass, in his day, was widely considered the most eloquent orator and among the handful of the greatest writers. Douglass's narrative influenced Dickens's Great Expectations. Dickens acknowledges it's one of many examples. He was considered a household name before Lincoln was known by anybody.
Gotta tell Steven Spielberg, don't put him in there.
Where
So
is the Douglas movie, by the way?
Douglas
Yes.
dies in 1895, and the erasure of Douglas meant that from roughly 1900 to 1950, Douglas is out of print. Now, African Americans are reading him. Douglas was hugely influential to Du Bois. African Americans have hugely inspired by him throughout, but whites have forgotten about him. When they remembered him in the 60s, Douglas was a good, nonviolent
Right.
liberal.
Right.
And one of Peniel's great contributions is to explode the myth of Martin Luther King Jr. being the great, good, liberal black hero that every white can love.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And Stokely is the dark twin,
That's right.
who we need to like throw into the
Put in
trash heap.
closet, yes.
And he just explodes that forgetting.
Yes.
So you want to
I
pick
mean-
up on that?
Elaine. go
Peniel
ahead.
has given me nothing on this one. But that book, Stokely A Life, is a must read.
Yes.
Now, where was I in the spring of 1963? Stokely and I were classmates.
Cool.
And we were sitting in a class. We both took, there were about 8 of us. Both took this class called Philosophy of Art, where we sat around and talked about Picasso's Cubist period. But what happened, Stokely had changed his major
I know, I want to touch you. Can I
from pre-med to philosophy. So that's why he was in it. And he was a year ahead of me in school. So, but we ended up there, and Stokely had been to Mississippi for 2 summers before. The summer 62 and the summer 61. So and Peniel is so right. Stokely was charismatic, brilliant. Had quicksilver intelligence. That Bronx science, that training that he got. And it was just reflected, and people would be drawn to him, but he was so approachable. And the way he thought through issues. Now, Stokely was there. Well, what was he, 20 then? 20, 21? Well, that's right. This is spring of 63. And very human. I saw you mention in your book, Mary Lovelace. And I had a job on the campus. Nobody had any money. So my job was in the dormitory. They had 5 dormitories connected to women's dorms. And I was one way in. And I was the one that had to buzz on the board to let women know when they had guests. And so when we had a breakout, because we had 9 o'clock curfew, when we had a breakout period to midnight, all the fellas would come to the lobby trying to get to the girlfriend. And I was between them and the girl. They were lining up. Oh, I had such power. I've never had that power since. But and I remember Stokely would say, Mary Felice Lovelace, Mary Felice, and I just knew where it was, and I would push Mary Felice Lovelace. But they were all coming, so sometimes I would see a face, and I would automatically go to push the button of the young lady, and they would say, oh, no, no, somebody there.
That's great. Wow. Well, I'm not sure what time it is, but this might be a good time to open it up. We can talk all night, and this is really wonderful. But maybe we can open this up to questions as we continue talking. One thing, as people go to the microphones, one thing I think is wonderful in your book, and I don't know if people know about this, you talked about how Lincoln was influenced by Douglas, and this is just a tidbit that caught my eye, was that, tell us very briefly, John, about Lincoln's original understanding of how long slavery might last before the Civil War?
In his debates with Stephen Douglas, when pressed on when Lincoln felt the ultimate extinction of slavery would occur, he said not less than 100 years, which would have put the end of slavery at the very earliest, 1958.
Tough stuff.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
And Douglas was instrumental in getting Lincoln to abandon his advocacy of colonization. Lincoln was a lifelong colonizationist. And also to recognize the crucial importance of, from Fort Sumner, Douglas said the easiest way to win this war is to use black power. Douglas actually invokes that term, black power. Black power is freeing slaves, arming them, and that's a potent source of black power because a third of the South is blacks. You bring them to our side, you put guns in their hands. They know the landscape. They're great intelligence people. They can immensely influence the Union Army. And Lincoln, by 1864, recognizes, he says the use of blacks as soldiers is not a matter of sentiment. It's a source of power. Lincoln invokes the term essentially black power. He said, keep them and we will win. Abandon them and we've lost. And Lincoln, like most whites at the immediate end of the war, they recognized the only way the Union wins the war is because of black power, of arming them. And Douglas was instrumental in convincing Lincoln.
And you also need to tell Spielberg
This
about
is why,
that.
yeah, Steven Spielberg, the Lincoln movie is so disappointing because there's no Frederick Douglass in there.
Yes.
And you introduced Lincoln to
and why is that important? This is, I mean, we're joking about this, but it's important because
it's very important. It's very important because
this continuing perception that African Americans waited passively
yeah,
for their freedom.
Yeah, this idea that we were given freedom, and I've heard even when in the context of Ferguson, people talking about how we were given voting rights and different things like that. I think that one, I mean, these things were real struggles, and two, it just shows that yes, even in the context of antebellum slavery, there was these interracial, because John does a lot of work on interracial friendships and relationships as well, and there are these interracial relationships that bypass what conventional thinking and wisdom, both of that time and this time, might be. So I think it's crucially important to know that one, black people weren't given freedom or liberation. They fought in every single war that this country has fought, and even going back to the Revolutionary War.
It's part of the forgetting. Many, if not most, white Americans to this day believe that Lincoln freed the slaves. I mean, many, if not most, white Americans to this day believe that Lyndon Johnson is responsible for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the laws we have.
And it's equally important for African Americans to understand that too.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's important for everyone to understand that because it's damaging in a different way for young black people, young black students who think that they were passive victims and never,
But what was true then is true now.
Absolutely.
It's the grassroots, the ground pressure. I mean, the politicians don't move now unless you are in their ear and near their votes and all of that sort of stuff.
What did Douglas say? Power concedes nothing without a
That's
demand.
Right.
Never has, never will.
That's right, which Obama quotes in The Audacity of Hope.
That's right. That's right. Oh, man. All right. So yes, we'll open it up.
Hi, my name is Pam. I'm enjoying this. And Professor Joseph, I'm curious. I've heard people who write historical biographies, they really live with the character. And what was it you learned about Stokely Carmichael that was different or new to you when you wrote this from what you'd known before?
Yeah, thank you for the question. No, I definitely did live with Stokely Kwame Ture for 10 years. You know, I think one of the things that was surprising was the friendship. A couple of things. One, on the political side and then the personal. The political side, how big of an anti-war protester Stokely was and how important his anti-Vietnam War protest was, both for the country, but also for Martin Luther King Jr. So I mean, I was surprised at that, and seeing how that went and how he was innovating the chant, "Hell no, we won't go," and that really caused a lot of problems, both for the country, but also for him, because the State Department, Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, people really start trying to devise ways to get him out of the country or neutralize him somehow. Initially, they check to see if he's a U.S. citizen because they're trying to deport him as soon as he does the Black Power
That doesn't
speech.
sound familiar at all.
There's great stuff where they find out he's a citizen. They're like, okay, we're going to do some. You know, he got citizen by derivation from his father in April of 1953. He was like in class at the time, and in New York City. They find that out, and then they say, well, we're going to charge him with sedition. you know, and they're very excited about the sedition charges. And then that doesn't really work out. And then they say, well, we're going to charge him with treason, right? And this is both for Black Power, but also, you know, anti-war speeches. So that was very, very interesting to find out. And then on the personal was Martin Luther King Jr., because I had been told that King and Stokely were like what John was saying, and I've written elsewhere, you know, civil rights, Black Power, sort of Black Power is the evil twin, and sort of Stokely as King, sort of, you know, his vicious alter ego, you know, and in sort of fulfilling the role that Malcolm, in the way they play it, was. And what you find out is they met in '63 when you maybe that same spring. No, that fall there was a civil rights conference at Howard. They meet, they continue to meet over the years. He serves as King's bodyguard and chauffeur during Mississippi Freedom Summer in '64. They march in Selma together in '65. And then on the Meredith March, they get very, very close in the summer of '66, late spring, summer of '66. And they have a great, great friendship, even though they have disagreements. And they also headline this major anti-war rally, April 15th, 1967 in New York. 400,000 people are there. And afterwards, Stokely is teasing King at Harry Belafonte's sprawling apartment. So Harry Belafonte used to have an apartment that had like 18 rooms in New York. Wow. I mean, it's unbelievable. And they're at that apartment, and King has just done his Riverside address, April 4th, 11 days earlier. Wow. And Stokely's teasing him and saying, you know, without me, you know, just paving the way, you wouldn't have done this. And King really jokes back, but he acknowledges it. And a couple of weeks later, he calls up Stokely on a Saturday night, and he says that, I want you to come. They're both in Atlanta. He says, I want you to come hear me preach tomorrow at Ebenezer. And he said, what are you doing tomorrow? And Stokely says, well, like a good heathen, I'm going to work for the people. I'm not going to your church. And that's Stokely Carmichael. I mean, he's teasing. And King says, I really want you to come to my church. And Stokely says, why do you want me to come to church so bad? And he says, King tells him that tomorrow I'm going to really come out against the Vietnam War in a bigger way than I ever have, right? And that's when King does this amazing speech that he concludes. That's the, you know, I'm not going to study war no more, right? And Stokely is there leading the standing ovation. And he had told King that night, he said, you know, I'm going to be in the front row, the front pew of your church tomorrow. And he's in the front pew of the church, right? So the interesting part about those two is that, you know, King asked Stokely for help with the Poor People's Campaign. They're going back and forth. And you know, when King is assassinated, Stokely, you know, almost has a nervous breakdown, is very, very upset. And he later says that he would have taken a bullet for Martin Luther King Jr. Like he loves Martin Luther King. And he writes in his own memoir that the reason he loved King so much was that King had such a big, vociferous love for poor black people. That was real. And Stokely did too. But he talks about seeing King, and he talks about King as a rock star, not just in a crowd like this, the erudite JFK Library, but King as a rock star in Alabama, you know, Lowndes County, Alabama, in Selma, in Mississippi. And Elaine knows too, where Stokely says, look, black people thought of King as if he was Jesus or something. And Stokely, instead of being pissed off or mad about that, like some in SNCC were, right? Yeah. Stokely says that when people ask me if I'm one of King's men, he said, yes, I'm one of King's men, right? So the love that they had for each other was really surprising, because I hadn't heard that.
And King came to Howard also in 1962 because he was the Charter Day speaker in March of 1962. Now, I don't know if he and Stokely interacted then, but I know, you know, that's when I first saw King, at that Charter Day.
62, wow.
62,
wow.
March of 62.
Wonderful.
That's great.
Let's go to this microphone. Yes.
I'm Hannah. Civil rights have always been very important to me because I'm in the health and human services and in education, and I have always been worried about disparities in resources, in opportunities, and as we discussed on Stokely, I think at some point his name was also Kwame Ture, right?
Yes,
yeah.
later.
Okay.
Yes.
And I just want to comment about his involvement with Pan-Africanism. I think one thing that strikes me is how civil rights and African-American history doesn't really also emphasize on the African heritage, that even before the contact of British and Europeans to Africa, we already had leaders who thought that they have good institutions and that they knew how to govern and they have their own ideas.
Right.
We were colonized. I was born and raised in Ghana. We were colonized by the British. Since first grade, I was told how great Europe was, all the great things they've done. I think if we can go back and change the school curriculum and let African history and how the empires and the big things we did for ourselves, I think there will be some recognition for the black race. Until we do that, these disparities and assumptions of majority of whites that we are helpless people and they are only doing us favor, we have to find a means to educate properly about the facts.
Thank
and
you.
I was wondering whether
Thank
you comment
Yes,
on that.
maybe people can get in here. I think that's a very important thing.
No, we didn't get into black power per se. It's certainly part of Stokely and the evolution to Kwame Ture and so many others is this acknowledgement and this move towards Pan-Africanism. But that's always been there in the sense of, David Walker, Martin Delaney, Douglas, but also
Garvey.
obviously Garvey, the
Garvey.
age of Garvey.
Yes.
But certainly the 60s and 70s, Pan-Africanism. I would say, if anything, that when we think about the Gary Convention and what was going on, African Liberation Support Committee in the 70s, I would say, I agree that in a certain way we've lost certain aspects of that, and that has to do with sort of post-colonial Africa becoming neo-colonial Africa, and that's had a different effect on the civil rights struggle here. So, and I would say the peak of this is sort of the anti-apartheid movement, right? And Nelson Mandela. So many people, including on this stage, were part of that anti-apartheid movement, but in the aftermath of that, there hasn't necessarily been those same kind of close connections, right? Because I think that the way in which Black Americans view Africa right now in 2014, and I don't mean educators and Pan-Africanists, I mean generally, is not necessarily as close as in a different historical time period. There was a period where people like Patrice Lumumba and people like Jomo Kenyatta and people like Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré were very much, Winnie Mandela. There's very much part and parcel of the pedagogical intervention here. But I still think that's occurring. I definitely think there's huge swaths of the African American community that knows exactly what you're talking about.
Right. We have to also let them understand, Africans coming here, understand civil rights and what African Americans sacrificed for all of us. Because if civil rights didn't pass, most of us wouldn't have the chance to be here. So we need to draw on how we have all contributed to the history of America as we see it today.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's an excellent point. I'll just make that point that I actually teach and I've told Peniel this, I teach a survey level lit class at Emerson, Introductory to Slavery and Freedom. And it occurred to me after teaching it 2 or 3 times that I actually had to start the first class with a brief lecture on the history of Africa before the Europeans arrived, because my students, many of whom are middle-class students, really did believe that it was, the heart of darkness. They had no understanding of the great empires of Mali and the great pre-colonial empires. They really don't know that, and that is really important information. So thank you for that. Yes.
Before we get to my own question, on this last point, I think the name of Dr. Du Bois should not be left out of the discussion. From the end of First World War on, he played a prominent role in this Pan-African movement.
Yep.
And of course, he died in Africa.
Yeah, he left.
But my main point has to do with a question that our excellent chairman raised: what's missing from the traditional narrative? And Brother Peniel did mention Marxists, Social Democrats, and trade unionists, for which I'm very thankful, but he didn't use the C word, of course. He didn't mention the communist contribution.
I said communist earlier.
You did say,
I said
I'm sorry
communist.
then.
Oh yeah, I've got no problem saying
just
communist.
quietly.
But I want to mention the fact that from the 20s on, with the African Black Brotherhood, with James W. Ford, with Angelo Herndon, Paul Robeson, just to mention a few names, there's always been a black black communist tradition. And the name of Lorraine Hansberry was mentioned, but before Raisin in the Sun, before a playwright, she worked on Freedom, which was really a black left-wing communist influenced newspaper in Harlem. And Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis also were involved in the Negro Theater, which was a black but communist-influenced theater movement. So I think it's very important to mention these, and not to be sectarian about it. If you mention the Trotskyist wing, one thinks of C.L.R. James, whose book, The Black Jacobin, certainly was a tremendous contribution to this. Now, of course, the communists did a lot to destroy their own movement, and I think a French wit put it very well. The trouble with the Communist Party was not that it was too far to the left, it was too far to the east. It was the fact of the Soviet influence that destroyed the great potential that the communist movement had in the United States, and I'm certainly not going to apologize for that. But I think it is very important to recognize this contribution, and it had a lasting effect in the later movements.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Yes, sir. Anybody want to add anything about that?
No, I
Very
think it
esteemed,
definitely did.
erudite
Covers that in the
audience.
book.
He covers that in the book. He does.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Thank you.
What is important to me is that the two periods, the heroic period, as you excellently phrased it, and the second period that came after, for me what was different, very important, was that as long as the civil rights movement was protesting against the horrible treatment of black people by white folks in the South, the northern ethnic whites were cheering it on. They said, "Go, guys, go. You're really fighting against oppression." But when the civil rights movement came to the North, it ignited a nuclear war. And I was ground zero in that. If you were a kid from one of those white ethnic groups, and I was traveling around the whole United States at 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, and listening to this every single day, and this was a nuclear war, and suddenly when, for example, when Stokely and other people like him came on TV, and my father and many other ethnic whites were screaming, "They want to kill all white people! They want to make us slaves!" And suddenly there was absolutely nuclear war, and between the white ethnic groups and the civil rights movement. And in fact, when I was in Chicago, when Dr. King came there and parading for open housing.
Open housing, yes.
Right. And they threw bricks and bottles at him. And Dr. King, in his incredible wisdom, said, "I saw more hate on those people's faces than I did in Alabama or Mississippi." And this is what I grew up in this second period, and I'm still shaking from it this day, 50 years later. I'm seeing that, and of course the New York City teachers strike, and all of this stuff that ruined my senior year in high school in New York.
Sorry. All right, well, let us take it. That's a good point. That's a very good point. That takes. Thank you for that. I appreciate that, because we didn't get to the discussion of the latter half, and maybe we can close with this about going back to the traditional narrative. The traditional narrative has it that the civil rights movement largely collapsed, I think, with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and in part because there's another question, that the movement had moved to the northern urban areas, and were fighting perhaps less visible targets than, whites-only signs and sheriffs with dogs. So I don't know, Peniel, if you want to jump in here and talk about the difference in the strategy and the goals once the movement moved north.
I know. I think you're right, Kim. I think the traditional narrative says that. I think what we now know, and there's so much great work on this, is that one, the movement doesn't collapse. Two, the movement was also always in the north, so there's all these movements about northern freedom studies. I do think what happens in the 1970s, though, and there's great scholarship on this, is that there's actually more social protests and disruption throughout the 1970s. The state, or the United States, the federal government and local states respond differently than they had in the 60s. Some of this has to do with who's president at the time, and Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter are the presidents. Some of this has to do with a loss of American hegemony and domination economically. So when you read the Thomas Piketty book about capital in the 21st century, he's making the argument that basically 48 to 73 is an anomaly. And that's the time period of the biggest relative economic growth and redistributive policies in American history, right? So some of it's saying that it's an age of decline. Some of it, there's repression. One of the things that, by the time we look at Michelle Alexander's work, but not just Michelle Alexander, Khalil Muhammad's work on incarceration in the 19th century.
Yes.
And Dan Berger has a new book, Captive Nation, about civil rights and prisons, right? The war on drugs, but even starting in the late 60s, early 70s, Rockefeller drug laws, it's really by 86, 88, those drug laws make it federal, but there's going to be more repression. So the interesting thing is that civil rights continues, these movements for social political justice continue all into the 70s, 80s, 90s, so sometimes people get it twisted that unless you were born in a certain context, you can't be an
missed
activist.
it, right.
I came out of law school in 1970, and I have spent 35 years in this country on civil rights issues. I mean, throughout the South, throughout Klan, the whole works. I mean, what you haven't had is the grassroots, the involvement of whole groups of folk where you see us on television every night, the atrocities and what have you.
Right.
What you have seen is trying to make a difference institutionally, break down the economic discrimination. The 64 Civil Rights Act with the getting rid of job discrimination wasn't implemented until the 70s and the 80s when we had to break down the discrimination industries. Women could have certain jobs.
Right.
Men had other jobs, certain jobs reserved for whites, certain jobs reserved for black. It took 20 years of Supreme Court decisions to really break that thing open. I mean,
So
issue after issue.
Right.
70s, 80s, and 90s. I mean, even now, I had a huge case in Texas where 10% of the black population in Tulia, Texas, arrested on bogus drug charges, just so they could get DEA money from justice. 10% of the population. Tulia didn't have 500 black people. So you arrest 50.
You do the math.
And it took, we had to go to Tulia, and it was a whole conspiracy that just so more money would come in from the Justice Department. So I'm saying that the issues are real.
Are still there. It's like the whole convict leasing system after after Reconstruction all over again, right? Slavery by another name. It's unbelievable, and it's going on now.
Voting, we have been under siege on the issue of voting.
Absolutely.
Just because you got this 65, the Supreme Court decided 3 days after Obama's second election to look at the Voting Rights Act. 3 days, and then struck it down a few months later. I mean, when it took all of that stuff from Lowndes County and Mississippi in order to get the act passed, and then all the years we spent getting it extended, year after, and now for just the court to say, although we got a 98 zip vote in the Senate, 390 to 33 in the House, and for the Supreme Court to just overrule the Congress like that and substitute its judgment, we are in a serious.
Which raises the question, yes, I agree. It raises and I'm not sure what time it is. You'll give me the heads up. We're good. So we're going to take a couple more questions, but it raises the question of I think maybe it links back into Ferguson too. What you're talking about, Elaine, is that maybe what's different now is that the battle goes on in courts and all that kind of stuff as opposed to in the streets and mass protests. But that's why Ferguson, regardless of what happens this week, might be considered optimistic because this is the re-energization of young people, activists in the street. Those kids have been there since that shooting and have been there organizing normal people, regular folks.
If they make that mistake, you talking about energizing a whole new generation of young people?
Exactly.
I don't care what color they are, because wrong is wrong.
Right.
And over history, we have dealt with nullification. Jurists decide when they killed Chainer, Goodman, and Sherner, jurists just decide not to indict her, not to convict, did it routinely. But I don't think the American people now, that's not where we want to go, and we don't want to revisit that. We want fairness in our justice system. That's what we want.
Well, I think that's a great sentiment. I think that's a great sentiment. I think that
It's a very optimistic
when we think
sentiment.
about Shelby versus Holder, I mean, one of the things I'll say with the 2013 decision and how we're commemorating the 50th of the Civil Rights Act, 50th of the Voting Rights Act, one of the things that's happened in the post-civil rights period or the post-heroic and post-Black Power period is that the country has two competing thoughts, multiple competing thoughts, and it can do it at the same time, right? And I think that is new in the sense that John will tell you, look, in 1864, you couldn't elect a black man president of the United States, right? So in 2008, 2012, you did. But at the same time, you have more African Americans incarcerated in the United States now than in any other period in the history of the Republic, right? So I think the unfortunate thing is I'd like to believe that sentiment in terms of Americans and fairness, but even when we do the polls and political scientists look at millennials, right? And certainly they're against, and we're talking about people 1980 and after born, they're against injustice and unfairness. They don't believe in affirmative action. Right? And they also, a quarter of them believe that white people face major discrimination.
More discrimination.
And major hurdles.
Discrimination
right?
is a bigger problem for white people than it is for people of color.
For people of color. I think the
statistic.
thing that we have to understand in the times that we live in are really very, very specific and peculiar times because next year is going to be the 50th of Selma, the Voting Rights Act. There's a new movie on Selma coming out. So the interesting thing about it's a very specific moment globally, sort of this neoliberal moment where everything, it's capacious enough to take everything in and sort of reimagine and refoster it, even as continued racial, political, economic, gender oppression. We have thousands of black women and girls who are missing in the United States right now. We've got domestic violence, and not just in the NFL, that goes untalked about, domestic violence and rape and sexual assault, especially against poor black women, especially against poor black and Latino women. Right here in Boston, the ACLU has released their report between 2007 and 2010. The number of black and brown men who were stopped by the police, 24% black folks in the city, they were 63-point-something% of the stops, right? So this continues, but here's the interesting part. It continues in a different way from the early 20th century in the sense that you also have different institutions that are celebrating at least a narrative of racial progress, right? So this is not Birth of a Nation, this is Selma is coming out in 2014,
But
right?
before Birth of a Nation, it's interesting is that the sons and daughters of the abolitionists in the 1880s to 1900, they were celebrating this great progress, even at the time in which the counter-revolution was succeeding. So, I mean, your point is absolutely apt in that the power of the memory, or the forgetting rather, is so important.
It's like you said about Stokely. I mean, the hope. Always, that's what inspires you to go on and not to despair, is because you really believe that things can fundamentally change. You have to have that.
No, we have to have reckless hope. We have to have dangerous hope, but we also have to be clear-eyed because I would encourage everybody in this room. I would encourage everybody in this room to get
prudent revolutionary.
To get the book Black Stats by the black sociologist Monique Morris, because that book just came out and she gives you up-to-date statistics regarding the African American community in terms of everything from they're only 2% in corporate America at high-level positions to the rates of black babies who are dying to the way in which black women right now are disproportionately suffering and dying from breast cancer, right?
Oh, yes.
They're not being diagnosed. So when we look at the social economic indicators, and this is away from the black middle class and the upper middle class and their white allies and friends, because there's 43.2 million black people. Only 10% make $100,000 a year or more just in salary in this country. All of this is a nightmare, people, and all of this would be a huge catastrophe if it was happening to white people.
And yesterday,
right? So we've got to get that. We've got to understand what that means.
We're going to get to you. We're going to get to you. We're going to get to these last two questions.
Yesterday, the right wing filed 3 lawsuits challenging the admission of African Americans to institutions of higher education. Filed one against Harvard.
UNC was the second.
One against University of North Carolina. and then third one against Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yesterday.
Okay, yes.
Quick question.
Oh, yeah.
Elaine Jones, you spent time in Turkey. I know we're going back a few years now, but I'm wondering what was being said overseas about our civil rights movement while you were there, and what was the conversation or the discussion, and what did you hear?
You know, that's why I sort of instinctively understood Stokely's moving, you know, just going to Africa. I mean, not only for, but there comes a time at some point that you feel you have to separate. You just got to go off somewhere else and get some perspective, you know. And so that's what I did when I left Howard. I went to the Peace Corps. I went to Muslim Turkey for 2 years. But you said, what would they think about the movement? Turks were shocked that this is late 60s, that there was any such thing as a black America. They just couldn't believe that. Black America? I mean, never seeing it, didn't understand that concept. They all thought I was Arabic. And you know, there was no love lost between the Turks and the Arabs. And so, you know, it was just total confusion. I would say, Sia, I mean, black. I said, Sia, America. No, it doesn't exist. So I didn't have to have those discussions about progress and what we were doing and that kind of thing, because I just didn't exist. But it was an eye-opener for me, just to immerse myself in a different culture and to learn something about how other people, other nations think and act and what's important to them. And because when I brought that back, it gave me a greater perspective. It taught me patience, and it taught me early on that was so much I did not know. And so you're in a constant state of learning.
Yes, so many African Americans left in the 60s. I mean, James Baldwin, of course, famously said he had to leave. Yeah, he loved Turkey. Yeah, he went back and over again. Yes.
First of all, thank you. You're a high-level panelist, and it's a good review for me, having been a kid who protested a lot in the 60s. And also was in the Peace Corps in Liberia. And I still am in touch with people in Liberia. My concern as a former educator, what worries me, because this is such an educational experience just being here, as well as a personal review, is it'd be great to know if there were educators in this audience, especially young people who are in education. What do they know in terms of the kind of history that we're really dealing with tonight? And also even about quote-unquote race relations. And I'm very lucky to have gone through that time period, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so on. But now, as being retired and looking back and asking young kids what they're doing in social studies classes anything related to the understanding of American history or black culture, I hear very little is going on. Is it that young teachers are not taking courses? The workshops aren't there, and it sounds a bit scary. And the thing that I have concern about, too, is that most white people don't know how to talk about race. That's a heck of an accusation to make. But that's been my experience.
Yes.
And they're afraid to talk about race.
Right. Yes.
Because people don't want to be, accused of being racist and not knowing what they have actually said. And it's a long process and an ongoing conversation. And it's almost like it has to be done at the community level, grassroots, if we're going to get anywhere.
Yes.
I mean, I thank you for what you're doing here, but we've got to take this home and just go, because we're just falling behind.
Thank you. I think that's, yes, Peniel?
I would say people are doing it. I understand your concerns. Me at Tufts, we've done a national dialogue on Race Day, and I've been in different public schools in different communities. One thing I'll say, even at the national level, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times has been having a great series, and I honestly tend to think...
And the blowback on that has been unbelievable, too, though. I mean...
I tend to think that white people really listen more when white people talk to them about race and racism than black people, because historically, even the whole valorization of King is really coming after his assassination. It's just not true that King was a very popular figure, especially the last 3 years of his life.
Absolutely.
Certainly not in the South. I mean, he was considered a troublemaker and somebody who was fomenting violence, okay? Because he was asking a country that was really unrepentantly, unapologetically racist and economically oppressive to change its ways against its will. So if people want to understand why King is assassinated, it's because of that. He's not going to go to the Poor People's March with a gun or a knife or even curse words, right? But he is saying all of this must change,
Right.
and that militarism, materialism, racism are these big triple threats to
triplets.
humanity, right?
Right.
That's very disturbing for millions of Americans. I just want everybody to know that.
And that's not going to be taught in our public schools.
That's not going to be taught in our
What's
public
going to be taught in our
schools.
public schools is, I have a dream of little black boys and little white girls sitting
Yeah.
down at the table of brotherhood and holding hands.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what my students get.
Yeah.
That's their understanding of the civil rights movement. That,
And we don't,
you know.
curriculum-wise, we don't have African-American history as mandatory. Like the
That's
city
what
of
I
Philadelphia
Right. Or even
has it.
real American history, which
Yeah.
is African American
Yeah.
history.
Get it on the approved curriculum.
Yeah,
You
right.
cannot
It's
get
very
it.
difficult. But there are African-centered schools. There are, there's a whole group of black folks who, even during the 60s, 70s, and throughout today, are teaching their kids a very specific curriculum, right? Jawanza Kunjufu
Right.
and other authors. So it's there.
But his
And there's-
point is that it's not just black kids that need to know it. All of Americans
Oh,
need
no,
to
I
know this, right?
completely agree
Yeah,
with
and
you.
I think
I
he's right.
completely agree.
And so I maybe we can just ask the audience, and then we'll move on to the next question. Are there educators here? Yay. Okay.
It's tough.
So there's hope. See? There's
tough.
there's hope, and we're all doing our part, right?
Yeah,
We're
absolutely.
talking to the students. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, good evening. I just firstly want to say thank you for all of you speaking and having this dialogue. Am I too close? Okay, sorry. And then secondly, I just wanted to point out, I am an educator. This is my third year being a middle school educator, and it's
Thank
really
you for your
hard.
service.
Thank you. It's really hard getting it approved. I remember the previous school that I worked at, it was in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the teachers had freedom with their curriculum. So I was able to have monthly projects where students were able to commemorate different communities of color and different marginalized communities. However, here, working in the Boston public school system, it's extremely difficult. Talking about Ferguson, I was responsible for creating the current events program, or the current events dialogue, the first one that the students had. And I thought it was really important to make it about Mike Brown and his passing and his murder that happened. And people who are on my team came and they sat me down and we just think this is really heavy to start the school year with. That's what they said. And I said to them, listen, if you're uncomfortable presenting this to your classes, then you don't have to do it. And then turning it back on them, it was a different conversation. It was like, oh no, I can do it. I can do it. I can talk about black violence. I can talk. So it changed from that point. When I gave them, that's what my perspective was. But I feel like, as I told my colleagues, that we're sending our students a message, we're sending our brown children a message when we do not talk about these racial issues. It's telling them implicitly that them being killed out in the streets does not matter, that it's not something that we should be talking about. And it's really difficult that right now, the course that I'm teaching, half the school year is talking about ancient civilizations, and there is no unit on African ancient civilizations. We have 2 full units that are about European ancient civilizations. We don't have any on African. So I have to be the person who's in the classroom having the discussions and connecting it to, okay, this is an indigenous nation here. We also can talk about an indigenous nation in Africa, about Mali, about, different nations that had greatness, and that was the reason I went into education, so brown students could know they come from greatness. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. That's great.
UMass Amherst. Yes, sir. Yeah, but that's where, so, sorry.
Yes,
but
yeah, I think we're gonna, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to move on, yeah. So we're gonna take these last 2, and then one more, last 2 people, because we're here. Yes, and try to, can you just tell us your question, ma'am? Yes.
It is definitely something wrong in our society. We have made a lot of strides, like you
Okay.
said.
Yeah. I'm sorry, can you?
A lot of progress. First of all, thank you for coming.
Right. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
The
Okay.
question is, like you said, we have made a lot of progress. What must we do to get there? You said we are not there yet?
Mm-hmm.
What is it we must do to get there?
That's a very good question.
What would Stokely
Who wants to
do?
answer that?
What would Stokely do?
I mean, Stokely became Kwame Ture and a revolutionary Pan-Africanist.
But if he were
And
left
left.
today,
Well, I think one of the interesting things is, that's a great question. And I think part of it has to do with how do we diagnose the problem. And I think that there's 2 major ways we can diagnose why there's so much social, economic, racial, gender oppression in the United States. You can say that the system itself is fine, but really needs to be fundamentally reformed. So that's one perspective. And from that perspective, it becomes that reform can be political, it can be economic, it can be sort of the way in which people try to treat Haiti, where Haiti has more NGOs per capita than any place in the world and still has real depth of poverty there, right? So that's a perspective in terms of let's try to reform the system. And from that perspective, I think many people who were very excited about Barack Obama in 2008, that was at least part of the philosophy. Certainly there were radicals and revolutionaries who were excited, some. But many people felt, well, let him handle it. So if we get this guy we like, black guy, good looking, pretty wife, beautiful babies, we were like, man, they're just going to handle it, right? It didn't turn out that way in terms of 6 years later. It didn't exactly turn out that way. Another perspective is that the system, and people talked about this in the 60s. They used to say words like power structure. And they used to use terms like imperialism. And they used to talk about capitalism in the 60s and 70s. Another perspective is that the whole system, and this is Malcolm X and Stokely and even King, needs to be fundamentally transformed, right? It needs to, redistribution of wealth, all these different things need to happen. So it really depends on what our diagnosis is, and then we can, but in the meantime, I think things like ending mass incarceration, I think things like stopping voter ID. I think there's many pragmatic things, public school education. It'd be great if we could talk about poverty again in the United States. One of the brilliant things about the whole idea of the Great Society is that we were at least talking about a great society. 50 years later, we've stopped even talking about a great society or a war on poverty, right? So even the rhetorical leap would be very important for us. If we said, look, 2015, imagine an America that has a great society and is willing to do a war on poverty. We went from a war on poverty to a war on drugs and mass incarceration, right? That's what we did. And we're seemingly the nation's fine with this.
Well, not only fine with it, I mean, go ahead.
I think what's blocking us as a nation is our hesitancy and our fear to even talk about issues having to do with race. That's a hesitant. We are on ground that we are uncomfortable. It's shifting. And we aren't clear about it. We don't want to offend. And we don't want to say anything to hurt anyone's feelings. But we need discussion. We need not only public education, we need education where we can sit down and talk honestly, where we can get at facts and find out really what the facts are, because we don't often get it. We don't get it from the media. We don't get it from the paper. We don't get it from the online. We don't get it anywhere. And so we have to, you all know what the real issues are and what's underlying, like all of the, and so we have to find a way to.
I think that's true, but and then we're going to move on to you, and then we're going to wrap up. But I think I love your. I'm with Peniel. I love your optimism, and John too. I hear you agreeing in. I wonder if it's really just fear or if it's resistance.
I think it's a counter-revolution that's similar to the counter-revolution that occurred after the successes of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment.
I agree.
That conservatives are digging in their heels and doing everything they can to preserve an old order, which essentially is to create a new order that tries to mimic that old order.
Yes, ma'am. Last question.
I'm a teacher as well, and being exposed to Eyes on the Prize in high school made me major and want to be a history teacher too. And in our high school, we do study the African civilizations. My colleague, who I'm here with tonight, and I have been here. We've seen Ernest Green and John Lewis, and now tonight we both had the opportunity to tour Selma and Birmingham with Fred Shuttlesworth a few years ago. We do as much as we can. It is hard sometimes to get. The further away you get from the civil rights movement, the less attachment. I mean, busing to me is still important because it's my parents' generation. We've used the movie Prom Night in Mississippi to make students realize, yeah, this is still going on. But I wonder, we teach in a predominantly white, affluent community. What can we do better? I mean, as college professors, what can we do better to help our students understand the issues that are still there today and better understand and connect to the civil rights movement, other than inviting Professor Joseph to speak at our school anytime you want to come.
Assign his book, assign Peniel's book.
No, she teaches middle school. I don't think.
You're teaching at a middle
school?
You teach
middle school?
High school.
Oh, high school? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
they can read it then. Yeah.
I think that what you're doing, one, I applaud you for the work that you and your colleagues are doing and being invested in these issues. I think one thing we have to do is talk about, and I've written about this in the aftermath of Ferguson, is that the United States, we stopped talking about black equality. And the reason why I say black equality is the common denominator for all this, and this connects to immigration. I hope the president signs an executive order. I hope that there's a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants who are both Latino, but they're also Asian, they're also African, right? And they are actually just undocumented global citizens who want access to American citizenship. So even when we keep on calling them illegals and all these different things, we're demonizing them, and we demonize the legacy and the credibility of the country globally. That's what opponents of immigration reform don't understand. But this idea of black equality is so important, because when we think about the work that we all do on this stage, the reason why it's black equality, and it can reverberate, and it has historically reverberated, gays, lesbians, transgendered, people who are Latino, Asian American, Native American, those who are physically challenged. The reason why it's not black people are so special is that historically they've been on the lowest economic rung and citizenship rung here in the United States. So the push for black equality is always a push for radical democracy. And if you can explain, one of the best parts about the Freedom Summer documentary is when you see white students in 1964 saying that my citizenship and freedom is locked into black people in Mississippi. My students today, 50 years later, they're stunned by that. They're stunned by that. They're saying, you mean that I have something in common with that person in Mississippi, right? And so that push, right, historically, at our best, we've understood that black equality is connected to transforming the nation state for people on welfare, for people who are, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, socialists, conservatives, right? That it's going to make this country and reverberating the world a better place, right? That's what was so exciting. When you hear Casey Hayden talk about going and connecting with SNCC, when you hear Tom Hayden and white activists talk about, they say, look, these black folks, we thought of them as the black existentialists. They were the cutting edge of human rights around the world. We realized we needed to go to Macomb, Mississippi, even if it meant endangering our lives, right? Because we were trapped in this web of humanity that Dr. King talked about. That's the beloved community. The beloved community is shared sacrifice for global citizenship and human rights. At any cost, at every cost. The beloved community is peace instead of war at any cost, right? And if we can connect that to our kids and say, black equality is connected to American democracy. There's a reason why King talks about the great wells of democracy. On one level, he's being too kind about the founding fathers. Right? He's being too kind.
Well, he's calling them to live up to their true.
Exactly. It's a rhetorical device. And it's a rhetorical sleight of hand that's hugely important.
Yes, and I think, in addition to inviting Peniel to your school, I would agree with everything he said, and maybe just add that I think it is making that for your students. What I try to do with my students, who are not much older than your students, I have your students 2 years after they leave you, right? Making the connection, everything we've said here, talking about understanding that this country, the fundamental, the racial issue and black people and slavery particularly was not a side event in American history, that the whole country is founded on that, does not exist without that. The wealth of this country was built on that. So they need to understand that, and understand also that slavery didn't end when it ended in 1865, right? We had slavery by another name with the convict leasing system and the vagrancy laws that re-enslaved African Americans. So what I try to get when I see the light bulb go on with my students is they see, A, it wasn't a side event, it was a central event. B, it didn't end, it just transformed, and therefore the goal, and this is what gets back to what I was saying at the beginning about also understanding that the goals of the civil rights movement were not just to end whites only signs and take down, lunch, let everybody be able to sit at the lunch counters. The March on Washington was the March on Washington for jobs and justice, right? And then you just have to say, well, let's look at what the jobs are and bring out some black unemployment statistics. So you just have to make the point, the movement is not finished because the goals were not met, if you understand what the goals were.
And the hope is, you saw so many activists, both of color, but also white activists in Ferguson, just like Mississippi, because some of the news reports were like, why are these people coming who are not even from Ferguson? And I'm thinking to myself as a historian, what about the people who came down to Mississippi, who came down to Birmingham, who came all over the world, right, to participate in this.
Made a huge difference.
Huge difference, right?
yes.
Like we've never been a nation where other people don't come from other states to participate in social movements, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I think the interesting part of all this is that if you can connect race to democracy at its most radical and expansive, you're right there. Because that's what Frederick Douglass, that's what Elaine, what we've all been doing. This is about small d democracy, but a bigger, more expansive democracy, I would argue, than even the founders had imagined. Because I will say, the founders did not imagine Hillary Clinton. They could not imagine
Everybody having the right
Barack
vote.
Obama. They could not imagine that, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
we've made this country much more expansive, but like John has documented, and Elaine has been right there in court struggling, and Kim has documented as well, this has been through blood, sweat, and tears. The optimism, though, is that that shared sacrifice produces a different United States of America.
And we've got to fight against the zero-sum game thing.
Yes.
When what I give you, I take away from myself.
Right.
That's the pie zone is so much. And there's no such thing as expanding the pie and we all benefit.
Yeah.
If I give you this slice, then that means it's a slice I don't have.
Exactly.
That is what's on the other side of this thing.
Yes.
And that's what we've got to fight against, because for us to really be the United States of America.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a perfect ending, so thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you.